Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Chaco War, 1930 to 1935. Now buckle up as we begin. In the heart of South America lay a vast, seemingly worthless wilderness known as the Gran Chaco, a region of thorny scrubland, swamps, and crushing heat that stretched across modern-day Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. For decades, this inhospitable territory had been largely ignored by the civilized world. But by the 1920s, rumors began to spread of vast oil deposits beneath its unforgiving surface. International oil companies, particularly Standard Oil backing Bolivia and Shell supporting Argentina, began to take interest in this desolate region. What had once been considered worthless wasteland suddenly became a prize worth fighting for, setting the stage for one of South America's most devastating conflicts. The seeds of conflict lay in colonial confusion and national pride. When Spanish rule ended in South America, the boundaries between the newly independent nations of Bolivia and Paraguay remained frustratingly vague in the Chaco region. Paraguay claimed the area based on old Jesuit missions and their deeper penetration into the wilderness, while Bolivia insisted the territory was theirs by right of colonial administrative divisions. Bolivia, landlocked since losing its Pacific coast to Chile in the War of the Pacific, desperately needed access to the Paraguay river system that flowed through the Chaco. Meanwhile, Paraguay, still recovering from the devastating War of the Triple Alliance that had killed most of its male population decades earlier, saw the Chaco as essential to its survival and economic future. Both nations began establishing military outposts in the disputed territory during the 1920s, creating a powder keg waiting for a spark. Tensions escalated dramatically when Bolivia began constructing Fort Vanguardia in 1931, deep within territory that Paraguay considered its own. The Paraguayan government, led by the young and ambitious Colonel Rafael Franco, viewed this as an intolerable provocation. On June 15, 1932, Paraguayan forces launched a surprise attack on the Bolivian garrison at Pitiantuta Lagoon, killing several soldiers and capturing the position. Bolivia responded with fury, mobilizing its larger army and superior equipment. President Daniel Salamanca of Bolivia, facing domestic political pressure and convinced that his modern army could easily crush Paraguay's smaller forces, decided to escalate rather than negotiate. The die was cast. What should have been a minor border skirmish was about to explode into a full-scale war that would consume both nations. International mediation attempts failed as national pride, and the lure of oil wealth pushed both countries toward the abyss of total war. Bolivia entered the war with seemingly overwhelming advantages. With a population of 2.1 million compared to Paraguay's 880,000, Bolivia could field a much larger army. More importantly, Bolivia possessed modern equipment purchased from European arms dealers, including tanks, aircraft, and artillery that Paraguay could only dream of acquiring. The Bolivian army was advised by German military experts, led by General Hans Kunt, a veteran of World War I who had previously served Bolivia during the 1920s. Kunt was confident that modern European military tactics would quickly overwhelm Paraguay's ragtag forces. Bolivia's strategy was simple: use their superior numbers and equipment to drive straight through the Chaco to the Paraguay River, cutting the country in half and forcing a quick surrender. On paper, it seemed like the war would be over within months. However, Bolivia's leadership fatally underestimated both the terrain they would be fighting in and the determination of their smaller neighbor to resist at all costs. Paraguay's situation appeared desperate, but the country possessed several crucial advantages that would prove decisive. Most importantly, Paraguay knew the Chaco intimately. For generations, Paraguayan settlers, woodcutters, and soldiers had lived and worked in this harsh environment, learning to survive where others perished. The Paraguayan army was led by Colonel José Félix Estigarribia, a brilliant tactician who understood that conventional warfare would be suicide against Bolivia's superior numbers. Instead, he planned to use the Chaco itself as his greatest weapon. The terrain was a nightmare of thornbush, seasonal swamps, and crushing heat that could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There were no roads, no reliable water sources, and no shelter from the elements. Estigarribia realized that if he could force the Bolivians to fight deep in this green hell, their modern equipment would become a liability rather than an asset. Paraguay's soldiers, toughened by poverty and hardship, would prove far more adaptable to the Chaco's brutal conditions than their better-equipped enemies. The first major battle erupted at Fort Boquerón in September 1932, and it immediately revealed the war's true character. Bolivia launched a massive assault with 75,000 troops, confident that their overwhelming numbers would crush the 619 Paraguayan defenders. But the attack became a nightmare. Bolivian soldiers, many recruited from the high Andes, collapsed from heat exhaustion in the crushing humidity. Their heavy uniforms and equipment became torture devices in the sweltering jungle. Meanwhile, Paraguayan forces, led by Major Rafael Franco, turned the fort into a death trap, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to launch devastating counterattacks. The siege lasted 3 weeks, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. Vultures circled overhead as bodies piled up in the thorny underbrush. Finally, on September 29, the surviving Paraguayan garrison broke out in a desperate night attack, escaping through terrain the Bolivians thought impassable. Bolivia had won the fort but lost the battle, suffering over 2,000 casualties, while Paraguay lost only 150 men. Strung by their Pyrrhic victory, Bolivia doubled down on their conventional approach, pouring more troops into the Chaco. By early 1933, nearly 60,000 Bolivian soldiers were struggling through the wilderness, supplied by long, vulnerable logistics lines stretching back to the Andes. But Paraguay had learned the war's first crucial lesson. Mobility and terrain knowledge trumped numbers and equipment. Estigarribia began implementing hit-and-run tactics, striking Bolivian supply convoys and isolated outposts before melting back into the impenetrable bush. Paraguayan soldiers became masters of camouflage, using the thorny vegetation to approach within meters of enemy positions undetected. They learned to survive on minimal water and food, while Bolivian troops required massive supply trains just to stay alive. The Chaco began to claim victims not through bullets, but through thirst, disease, and heat stroke. Bolivian hospitals, filled with soldiers suffering from tropical diseases their mountain-dwelling bodies couldn't resist. General Kunt's European tactics proved useless in this alien environment. The tide of war began to turn decisively at the Battle of Nanawa in January 1933. This seemingly minor outpost became the scene of some of the most brutal fighting in South American history. Bolivia concentrated 75,000 troops for what they believed would be a knockout blow, supported by aircraft and artillery. But Paraguay had transformed Nanawa into an elaborate defensive maze, with interconnected trenches, hidden bunkers, and carefully planned kill zones. For 5 months, wave after wave of Bolivian attacks broke against these defenses like surf against rocks. The battle became a grinding war of attrition that evoked the worst horrors of World War I's Western Front. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in trenches filled with mud, blood, and corpses. The stench of death became so overwhelming that even hardened veterans vomited when the wind changed direction. Machine guns mowed down Bolivian infantry, advancing across open ground, while Paraguayan snipers picked off officers and sergeants. By June 1933, Bolivia had suffered over 7,000 casualties while failing to take a single major objective. As 1933 progressed, Bolivia's military situation deteriorated rapidly despite their apparent advantages. General Kunt's rigid European tactics continued to fail catastrophically in the Chaco environment. Bolivian soldiers, many of them indigenous people forcibly recruited from Andean villages, suffered terribly in the alien lowland climate. They had no understanding of why they were fighting and dying in this distant hell, leading to massive desertions and low morale. Meanwhile, their modern equipment became increasingly useless tanks bogged down in seasonal swamps. Aircraft struggled with the humidity and lack of proper airfields. and heavy artillery pieces couldn't be moved through the roadless wilderness. Supply lines stretched over 300 miles through hostile territory, making them easy targets for Paraguayan raiders. Disease ravaged Bolivian camps as soldiers who had never encountered tropical illnesses succumbed to malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever. Most critically, Bolivia was running out of money to sustain their massive military effort, while Paraguay's smaller, more efficient army required far fewer resources to maintain in the field. By mid-1933, Paraguay had seized the strategic initiative through superior leadership and adaptation. Colonel Estigarribia proved himself a master of mobile warfare, constantly wrong-footing his enemies with unexpected maneuvers. He realized that the key to victory lay not in holding territory, but in destroying Bolivia's ability to fight. Paraguayan forces began encircling isolated Bolivian garrisons, cutting off their supplies and forcing them to surrender or die of thirst. The most spectacular example came at Fort Alahuatar, where 25,000 Bolivian troops found themselves trapped without water for days. Many went insane from thirst, drinking their own urine or even mud mixed with gasoline. When they finally surrendered, hundreds of prisoners had to be hospitalized for dehydration and heat stroke. These tactical victories had enormous psychological impact. Bolivia's seemingly invincible army was being systematically destroyed by an enemy they had expected to crush easily. International observers began to take notice as David bloodied Goliath's nose repeatedly. Paraguay's confidence soared, while Bolivian morale collapsed completely. The war's turning point came with the Battle of Campo Villa in December 1933. Bolivia launched what they intended as their final, decisive offensive, committing their last reserves in a desperate attempt to break Paraguayan resistance. Over 10,000 Bolivian troops advanced in multiple columns, supported by their remaining aircraft and artillery. But Estigarribia had laid an elaborate trap, allowing the Bolivians to penetrate deep into Paraguayan-held territory before springing his ambush. Using their superior knowledge of secret trails and water sources, Paraguayan forces struck simultaneously at multiple points, cutting the Bolivian columns into isolated fragments. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Separated units wandered lost in the thorn bush, dying of thirst and heat exhaustion, while Paraguayan raiders picked them off at will. Entire regiments simply disappeared into the green hell, their fate unknown until their skeletons were discovered years later. Bolivia lost over 75,000 men in the disaster, including most of their remaining experienced officers and NCOs. Their army was broken as an effective fighting force. Following their devastating victory at Campo Villa, Paraguay seized the offensive for the first time in the war. Estigarribia launched a series of coordinated attacks designed to drive Bolivia completely out of the Chaco. Paraguayan forces, now battle-hardened and confident, advanced rapidly through territory they knew intimately. Fort after fort fell to their lightning attacks, with demoralized Bolivian garrisons often surrendering without serious resistance. The roles had completely reversed. Now it was Paraguay that seemed to possess overwhelming advantages, while Bolivia struggled just to maintain coherent defensive lines. International opinion began to shift as Paraguay transformed from underdog victim to aggressive conqueror. The League of Nations attempted to mediate, but both sides were now committed to total victory. Paraguay's success brought new problems, however, as their limited resources were stretched thin by rapid expansion. They needed to win quickly before their own logistics collapsed, but Bolivia's retreat toward more defensible positions near their own borders meant that the easy victories were ending. The war was entering its final, bloodiest phase. As Paraguay pressed their advantage in 1934, the human cost of the war reached staggering proportions. Casualty reports became almost meaningless as entire units disappeared into the wilderness, their fate unknown. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, and yellow fever ravaged both armies. Field hospitals overflowed with victims of heat stroke, dehydration, and tropical diseases that mountain-dwelling Bolivian doctors had never seen before. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from lack of medical supplies, and the impossibility of evacuation through roadless jungle. Mass graves were dug daily, but many bodies were simply left to rot where they fell, picked clean by vultures and insects. Soldiers on both sides began to crack under the psychological strain. Shell shock and combat fatigue created thousands of walking wounded who would never recover from their mental trauma. Letters home spoke of hell on earth, of comrades driven insane by thirst, and of landscapes carpeted with human bones. Yet the war continued, driven by national pride and the sunk cost of so much previous sacrifice. Bolivia's position became increasingly desperate as Paraguay advanced toward the foothills of the Andes themselves. The Bolivian government, facing massive casualties and economic collapse, finally dismissed the incompetent General Kunt and desperately searched for new leadership. Meanwhile, Paraguay's forces reached their furthest advance at the Battle of El Carmen in 1934, coming within striking distance of Bolivia's vital oil installations. However, Paraguay was now facing the same logistical nightmares that had plagued Bolivia earlier in the war. Their supply lines stretched over 400 miles through hostile territory, and their small industrial base couldn't support such an extended campaign. Estigarribia realized that Paraguay had reached the limits of their capability. They could advance no further without risking total collapse. More importantly, they had achieved their primary war aim of securing the Chaco region. International pressure for peace was mounting as neighboring countries feared the conflict might spread. Both armies were exhausted, depleted, and on the verge of mutiny. The time for negotiation had finally arrived, but pride and politics made peace negotiations as difficult as the war itself had been. The final phase of the Chaco War was marked by increasing desperation on both sides. Bolivia, facing complete military collapse, began drafting ever younger men and even considered using poison gas against Paraguayan positions. Their economy was in ruins, with the government spending over 80% of its budget on the war effort while neglecting basic domestic needs. Public protests erupted in La Paz and other cities as news of the military disasters reached home. Meanwhile, Paraguay, despite their battlefield successes, was also approaching the breaking point. Their tiny population couldn't sustain much longer the loss rates they had been accepting, and their primitive economy was straining under wartime demands. Both countries were essentially fighting with IOUs, having exhausted their financial resources years earlier. International creditors began demanding payment while arms dealers refused further credit. The human cost had become unbearable. Conservative estimates suggested over 100,000 dead from a combined population of less than 3 million. Entire villages had lost their young men, and both countries faced demographic catastrophes that would last for generations. International intervention finally brought the warring parties to the negotiating table in 1935. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and the United States formed a mediation commission, threatening economic sanctions against whichever side refused to negotiate. The League of Nations also applied pressure, though their influence in South America was limited. More importantly, both Bolivia and Paraguay were facing internal political crises that made continued warfare impossible. In Bolivia, military defeats had triggered a revolution that overthrew President Salamanca, bringing to power a military junta desperate to end the costly conflict. Paraguay, despite their military success, was economically exhausted and feared that prolonging the war might invite intervention by larger neighbors. The first tentative ceasefire was declared in June 1935, though sporadic fighting continued for several more months as local commanders struggled to control their battle-hardened troops. Many soldiers had been fighting for 3 years and knew no other life than war. The transition from total war to peace negotiations proved almost as difficult as the conflict itself had been. The peace negotiations dragged on for months as both sides struggled to accept the war's harsh realities. Paraguay, as the military victor, demanded recognition of their conquest of most of the Chaco Boreal, while Bolivia desperately tried to salvage something from their catastrophic defeat. The mediating powers worked tirelessly to craft a compromise that would allow both sides to claim some measure of victory while preventing future conflicts. The economic dimension proved crucial. Paraguay simply couldn't afford to garrison and develop the vast territories they had conquered, while Bolivia needed to end the financial hemorrhaging that threatened their national survival. Slowly, a framework emerged that would give Paraguay sovereignty over most of the disputed territory, while guaranteeing Bolivia access to the Paraguay river system they desperately needed for trade. Both sides would receive some oil concessions, though the irony was that little oil was ever found in the regions that had cost so many lives. The negotiations were complicated by internal political instability in both countries, as war-weary populations demanded accountability from leaders who had led them into catastrophe. The final peace treaty was signed on June 12, 1935, formally ending 3 years of brutal warfare that had devastated both nations. Paraguay emerged as the clear winner, gaining control over about 3/4 of the disputed Chaco boreal territory, roughly 100,000 square miles of land they had paid for with rivers of blood. Bolivia retained a small portion of the region and, crucially, guaranteed access to the Paraguay River through a corridor that would allow them to ship goods to the Atlantic. Both sides agreed to exchange prisoners, though many had already died in captivity from disease and maltreatment. The treaty also established mechanisms for future dispute resolution, hoping to prevent another such catastrophe. However, the deeper issues that had caused the war remained largely unresolved. Both countries were economically ruined, politically unstable, and demographically devastated. The promised oil wealth proved largely illusory. Most of the petroleum reserves were actually located in areas that remained under Bolivian control, making the massive sacrifice of life even more tragically pointless. The great powers moved on to other concerns, leaving the two exhausted nations to rebuild from the ruins of their ambitions. The aftermath of the Chaco War left both nations scarred for generations. Bolivia lost an estimated 65,000 dead from a population of just 2.1 million, proportionally one of the highest casualty rates of any 20th century conflict. Paraguay, despite their victory, suffered approximately 36,000 deaths from their tiny population of 880,000, creating a demographic disaster that would affect the country for decades. Thousands more veterans returned home crippled by wounds, disease, or psychological trauma that contemporary medicine couldn't treat. Both countries faced enormous debts to foreign arms dealers and creditors, money that could have been spent on schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. The war's political consequences proved equally devastating. Bolivia experienced a series of military coups and revolutions, as the humiliating defeat discredited the traditional ruling class. Paraguay's victory brought temporary stability, but also established a pattern of military dominance in politics that would last for generations. Most tragically, the vast oil deposits that had supposedly justified the enormous sacrifice proved to be largely mythical. The Chaco contained far less petroleum than anyone had hoped, making the war's human cost seem even more senseless. The Chaco War stands as one of history's most pointless yet devastating conflicts, a cautionary tale about the dangers of nationalism, resource greed, and military incompetence. Over 100,000 people died fighting for a wilderness that proved to contain little of the oil wealth that had motivated the conflict. Both nations emerged economically ruined and politically destabilized, with scars that would last for generations. Bolivia's defeat led to a series of revolutions and military governments, while Paraguay's victory established a tradition of military rule that culminated in Alfredo Stroessner's brutal dictatorship. The war demonstrated how quickly modern conflicts could spiral out of control, consuming entire nations in pursuit of illusory goals. International mediation, while eventually successful, came too late to prevent enormous human suffering that could have been avoided through earlier diplomatic intervention. The legacy of the Chaco War serves as a reminder that the true costs of warfare are always paid by ordinary people who have little say in the political decisions that determine their fate. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.